So now that we've managed to pass some data into our database, the next step is to set up authentication so that we can register some new users for our FlashChat app. The first thing we need to do is head over to the dashboard of our Firebase console, and we're going to click on the authentication tab over here. And that will take us to a authentication setup. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to the sign in method, and we're going to enable the email/password sign in method. So just go ahead and click enable, and we're going to save this so that our app allows users to sign up and sign in using their email and password combination. Now, as you can see, there's various other methods that you can enable, and Firebase has extensive documentation on how you can use these different ways of signing in with Google or signing in with Facebook. Now, because Firebase is a Google-provided service, signing in with Google is a really easy method to implement as well. So if you're interested, go ahead and have a look at the documentation and see if you can implement that as an additional challenge. So now let's head back to our app. And if you have a look inside the main.storyboard interface builder section, we can review and see how our app is set up. So I'm just going to pinch to zoom on the trackpad, and you can see that we've actually got quite a few screens in this app. So firstly, we've got a welcome screen, which is where all users first land. And from here, they can choose to register, or they can choose to log in if they've already registered. Now, the register button takes the user to a registration screen where they can enter an email and password and register themselves. And the login should take the users to the login screen where they can again type in their email and password to log in. Now, once they've registered or logged in and that's been successful, we will take them to the chat view controller. And this is composed of a table view with a whole bunch of cells that's going to display each of the messages from the recipients and from the sender. Over here, we've also got a logout button where the user can log out of their service. And down here, we've got a message entry text field as well as a send button. So we're going to talk about how we configure and set those up in a little while, but the first thing I want you to do as a challenge is to link up the welcome screen to the login screen, because at the moment, if you have a look at the segues, we've only got a segue that's linked to the register screen. The login view controller is currently completely inaccessible because we've yet to set up the segue, and this is so that we can remind you guys about segues and get you to set one up for yourself. So go ahead and link up the login button to the login screen using a push segue. Okay, so as you remember, it's not so difficult. All we have to do is select the login button, either in the interface builder or in the document outline over here, and we're going to hold down the control key, click, and point it towards the screen that we want to link it up to. And then once we let go, we can choose to have a push action segue. And there we go, our brilliant new segue has been created. Now, as you remember, all segues need an identifier. So if you have a look at this segue where we go from the welcome screen to the chat screen, we've given an identifier called go to chat, and this one is called go to registration. So we have to give this one that we just created a name as well, and we're going to call it go to login. And hit enter, and now all our segues have an identifier and we'll be able to refer to them and trigger them in our code. Alright, so we're ready to register some users. Let's go ahead and switch to the assistant editor so that I can show you what we've already linked up on the register view controller. So once I click on the register view controller, you can see that automatically we get the register view controller.swift file showing up over here, and you can see that we've already pre-linked some IB outlets and IB actions. So this one, the email text field, is linked up to this field up here, and this password text field is linked to the place where the user is going to enter the password. And finally, we've got an IB action that's linked to the register pressed button, and in here we're going to set up a new user on our Firebase database. So I'm going to hit Command Enter to change to the single editor screen, and we're going to head over to the Register View Controller to register some users. Now remember, as always, when we want to use a module that we've incorporated into our project, we always have to first import it. So let's go ahead and import Firebase at the top. And inside Register Pressed, we're going to put the code for our Firebase authentication. So Firebase makes authentication really, really simple, and they actually have a pre-built method called create user with email and password that we can use to set up registration for our users. So if you're interested in knowing how we found all these methods, then you can go to the Firebase documentation and go to their iOS API reference, and you can see how to do various things. For example, what are the classes that exist? How do you use Firebase authentication, for example? And you can see here they've got the classes, the constants. So if we have a look at Firebase authentication and we have a look at their overview, you can see that you can use FearAuth to manage authentication for Firebase apps. And then if you look at that class in more detail, you can see that we can grab the current user's details using the current user parameter, or we can use its methods like sign in with email password or create user with email password. And this is the one that we're going to be using. So it gives you a little bit of snippet in terms of how you can write this in Swift, how you can write it in Objective-C, or what are the parameters and inputs that you need to give the method and how it works. So let's go ahead and implement that in our code. So again, inside the IB action register pressed, we're going to tap into this FearAuth class, and we're going to tap into authentication and create user with email and password. So the email input that we're going to give is whatever the user typed into the email text field over here. So that's going to be email text field dot text, and the password is going to be the password text field dot text. And finally, upon completion, what do we want to happen? So this is where the callback occurs. Now, creating the user, Firebase will do that in the background, so it doesn't freeze up the user interface. i.e., you can still click on buttons, you can still navigate in the app, but it's doing all of this behind the scenes and networking with the Firebase database. But once that's completed and once it was successful, then it'll give you a callback telling you that it's complete and it was either successful or there was an error. So we want to tap into this completion block. So all that we're going to do is we're going to select this placeholder, and you're just going to go ahead and click enter so that we enter some of the template code for this method. We're going to give the callback parameters some names. So these are the things that Firebase will send back to us, i.e. some user information, and we want to call the error. So now, once the authentication has been completed and the callback is triggered, we want to check to see if there were any errors that got sent back. So if error is not equal to nil, i.e. there was an error, then we want to print out that error into the console. But on the other hand, if the error was nil, i.e. there were no errors, then that's essentially where everything was successful, and we can print into the console registration successful, so that we know as developers that the registration part of our app is working. So let's go ahead and run our app and try and set up a new user. Okay, so we're going to hit the register button, and that takes us to the register screen, and then we're going to enter an email. And remember, because we're the first users on our service, then you can pretty much put in anything in here and it won't clash with another user. So for testing purposes, we tend to try and keep this as simple, as short as possible. So I usually write something like a@b.com because in most email validations, the checks that you need to pass are, does it contain a @ symbol? Does it contain a .com or .co.uk or one of the recognized suffixes? And for the password, I'm just going to write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we're going to go ahead and hit register. So if you have a look in your console here, you can see that among a whole load of messages that Firebase sent you, once you configured your Firebase database, at the bottom, you can see our print statement, registration successful. So great, our code is working and we're able to set up a new user without any problems. Now, if you tried to violate some of those rules of validation that I mentioned earlier on, say if you just tried to write 1, 2, 3 as your email and you hit register, then you can see that Firebase will give you an error, and the error that gets printed using our print statement has a error code and has a error body, and the body says the email address is badly formatted, i.e. you failed the validation check. So with these few lines of code, we were able to create a user on our Firebase database, and we were able to check to see if there were any errors in terms of validation or in terms of networking or with creating users on our database. And we were also able to check to see if it was successful, in which case we print success. So now you can also go back into your Firebase database and you can have a look at your users tab under your authentication tab. You should be able to see the email of the user. You won't see the password because that's of course private, and you can see that it was created using the email and password method. So you can either add users to your database through this service, or of course usually the user should be adding themselves in your app using this create user method. Now, for some of you, you might see an error generated in the console that says access not configured. Google Identity Toolkit API has not been used in the project. So if you see something like that, instead of getting our success message, then have a look at the text below this video to fix this Identity Toolkit API problem. Now, you might have noticed that something is a little bit off with our password field. Normally, when we type our password, whether if it's on the web or whether if it's in an app, the actual letters or numbers that we type in are obscured so that somebody looking over our shoulder can't see our password. Now, we can implement this very easily by just going over to the main.storyboard and clicking on the password field and going into the attributes inspector to change it to a secure text entry, which means that instead of seeing the letters and numbers, we will now just see round circles. So let's go ahead and change that to make our app a little bit more secure. And the other problem that you might have noticed is that once we've successfully registered, say let's register another user, 123@321.com, and hit register, you can see that in the console, registration was successful, but nothing happens on screen. Now, what do we want to happen? Once the user's been registered, then we want to be able to send them straight to the chat view controller instead of getting them to log in again, because that would be bad user experience. So here, the register view controller is linked up to the chat view controller through a segue, and the segue has the identifier go to chat. So we can perform that segue once the registration is successful. So if you remember, the code for that is perform segue with identifier, and the identifier is going to be go to chat, which we copied from the main.storyboard, and the sender is of course this current view controller, so self. So now if you try to run the app at this stage, Xcode will give you an error, and the error says implicit use of self in closure. Use self dot to make the capture semantics more explicit. So what does this mean? Normally, when you call a method, up to now, we've never used this keyword self in front of the method. But in fact, what we're doing is we're saying, look for this method, perform segue, inside this current class, because perform segue is common to all UI view controllers. So by having our register view controller inherit from the UI view controller, we also get access to this class method called perform segue with identifier. Now, normally, if I try to do this inside, say, view did load, perform segue with identifier, put in an identifier, set sender as self, then Xcode has no complaints. It's happy with that. It's able to look within the current class first and try to find this method instead of looking somewhere else, like say inside login view controller or inside the chat view controller for this method. But when you're inside a closure, so remember, closures are functions without names. So they have inputs, they have a body, and they can even have an output. But inside a closure, because it's equivalent to having a function inside another function, it can get confusing for the compiler. So in Swift, in order to call a method inside a closure, so remember, every time you see the in keyword, then you're probably inside a closure, then you have to specify where this method occurs. And this, of course, is a method inside our current class. So all we have to do is write self.method to tell Xcode that this is so. In the next lesson, we're going to be talking about closures in more detail. But for now, remember that whenever you're trying to call a method inside a closure, you're going to have to add the self keyword before it. So with that fixed, we can go ahead and run our app and see what happens when we try to register our user again. All right, so we're on the welcome screen. We're going to hit register to go to the register screen. And again, I'm going to register another new person. So 1at2.com, password. You can see the password is now obscured because it's secure text entry. And then when we hit register, it takes us over to the chat view controller, which is exactly what we want to happen. So we've successfully managed to implement our register view controller, and we're now able to register new users to our service. In the next lesson, we're going to talk a little bit more about these closures that we saw and how we can use them as callbacks to be notified when a background process completes and to do something once that callback is triggered. So I'll see you on the next lesson.